Hey folks, my name is Matt Summerfield and I am the senior pastor of Zio Church, and really excited about the next 5 weeks, because what a year 2020 has been. This has not been the year that we've been expecting, not in any sense of the word. And the challenge of this moment of COVID has taken us all by surprise. None of us were expecting it. We weren't expecting to go through this global earthquake that we've been battling with. And unsurprisingly, it's put a huge amount of pressure on just about every single sphere of our lives, on our emotional health, our relationships, our money, our parenting, our friendships, on everything. And so tonight, with my good friend, Dr. Kate Middleton, we're going to be looking at the first of 5 areas to think about how can we live well in pandemic times, with a focus tonight on emotional health. But Kate, why don't you just introduce yourselves and let everyone know who you are?
Thank you very much, Matt. Yes, so I am a psychologist by background, but currently working with you, as well as a church leader across at Zio, and also in contact with many other churches across the UK, which is awesome, through a role that I have as the director of the Mind and Soul Foundation. And we're a national organisation working with this whole wonderful field of mental and emotional well-being. And it has been interesting times to be doing that. So we've been very busy over the last 6 to 7 months.
Very busy, absolutely. And I do remember, actually, you and I, we did a first little interview back in May. And so, in fact, about emotional health. And we would encourage people, if you go to our Zio Church page on YouTube, our Zio Church channel, you can go back to May, or maybe even our hosts who are on tonight can put the link for that into chat, and you can catch up on a talk that we did, what was now 6 months ago. Like, where has the last 6 months gone? It's just kind of crazy.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, tonight we're talking about emotional health, Kate. And I guess some people are going to think, well, I'm good. Like, emotional health is not an issue for me. Like, is tonight's subject relevant for some of us, or is it relevant for all of us?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? And I think in some ways that's what's really interesting about this season, because what it's done is brought home to us something that is a truth, which we perhaps hadn't appreciated before now, which is that we all have emotional health. And the temptation is to be a bit us and them about it. There's like 2 boxes. You're either ill or you're well. And most of us like to think we're in the well box. And maybe at times something happens and we move into the other box. But that we like to keep those 2 spaces very separate in our minds. But the reality is, just like physical health, it's like a line, and we're all on that line somewhere. We all have emotional health. And sometimes life throws things at you that move you up and down the line, challenges, tough stuff, emotional stuff that emerges that you haven't dealt with from the past or whatever. Or a season like this, which uniquely has pushed us all into a place where emotional health and well-being is under pressure. And, you know, it's fascinating to me as a psychologist, because usually I'm speaking into people's situations and it is a bit like I'm sort of from outside speaking in, but now in this season, more and more, and especially now, because like you say, gosh, May, it seems like ages ago, and we're still in this. And this is a season that has challenged us all. So I'm sharing stuff that I am putting into place for me. I'm having to be so intentional about my own mental and emotional well-being, but also for my family. And the key thing is not waiting until somebody somewhere slips into that ill box and we have a crisis, but just thinking, how do we maintain so that we don't get ill? Can we get through this and do it well? Keep our heads above water? Because what started in March, and maybe we all thought, gosh, a few months, I don't know. Now, like you say, oh my goodness, we're way down the line. And we're talking about 5-6 months more still to go. And I read a thing at the end of last week that described it as a perfect storm of awfulness, which is such an evocative description, isn't it? And like, let's be real, this is rough. I mean, I don't know about you, Matt, but I've had times where I found this really hard in the last 6-7 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a way that I've never really encountered stuff before.
And I guess the challenge is now, like when we were in this in March, and when we did that video back in March, even when people were in lockdown before, like we were coming into the spring, we were coming into summer, people could be out more. We were kind of blessed with some good weather. Now we're in winter, and we know, and I'm sure you'll tell us as a psychologist, like winter is difficult for some people anyway, just with a kind of level of sunshine and just there's more darkness. So we know that winter can be an impactful time for many people, but now that is amplified by the roller coaster that's COVID. And so what are some of the issues that people may be feeling even more so now than they were in the previous lockdown?
Yeah, and we'll talk in a bit about some really practical things, because I think we sometimes read too much into like light levels and all of this stuff. But I think the problem with winter is we instinctively just don't do things that actually do help our emotional health. And in the spring, you're more likely to do them instinctively, aren't you? Like, so I'm a big biker. I love to get out in the fresh air. But even for me, the last month or so, I've been a lot less keen to do it than I was at the beginning of the last lockdown. And I kind of forced myself to go out this weekend. And so some of these things are about intentional behavioral things that we can do that will help us. So we'll talk about them in a bit. But I think the biggest challenge of this season actually is just we're all fed up of it, and we're all exhausted, and this challenge of despair, which is probably the worst emotion that there is to deal with. I think just despair, it's that awful, it's that horrible sort of overwhelming, suffocating feeling, isn't it, where you just feel like I can't do this anymore. You know, there's so many, we all experience it in different ways. You just think, I just can't, I've had enough, I can't carry on. You want to give up, stop trying. And what's interesting is at a brain level, you actually have a part of your brain, annoyingly, which triggers that feeling of despair. And it's all to do with moments where you feel out of control, where you feel you can't change anything, you can't have influence over anything. As humans, we're so designed to need to be in control. We were put together in that way to try and bring order and control and achievement and productivity to our world, to do that for the people we're caring for. And when we're in situations like this, where just that, unfortunately, the reality that there's an awful lot of things we can't control, when we just experience that in such a relentless, brutal way, day after day, time after time, it triggers that despair center all the time. And that helps us to understand, I think, why this season is so hard. You know, everything keeps changing. And so many of the things that we're facing are a lack of control that is, there's that word again, unprecedented, but things that we've just not come across. I mean, we as a family, Matt, are on our second 14 days of isolation now, because child number 2, one of the kids in his class, was tested positive literally 2 weeks and 2 days ago. So we've just come out, woohoo, we're all out again. And then child number 1 had the call on Saturday. I mean, that thing of you get a phone call in a moment and suddenly your world changes.
Absolutely.
And you're like, we've never had that experience before. Like, suddenly I'm thinking it's now illegal for me to let my 8-year-old leave the house. That's weird. And or for you to leave the house, or for my daughter who's 15, those who don't know us. And like when we are in those situations, our brain looks for other stories, other contexts to try and understand what's going on. And all of the ones we draw to mind are negative. So like my daughter and I chatting, she's like, I feel like I'm being punished and I haven't done anything wrong. My son's like, am I in prison, mum? They're all negative contexts. And so sometimes in these situations, what we need to do is think about how can we overcome just the despair that is a challenge, but also how can we put together stories and frameworks to understand what's happening better, and do that really intentionally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is that ongoing sense of kind of despair, frustration, is like you're saying, just the uncertainty. Like when you feel like you've got used to something which is very, very different, and then it changes again, and then it changes again. And as we had last week, it changed very quickly. And here we are again. And like, obviously we're hoping we're going to come out of this lockdown, but again, you know, I know that many people are thinking, but will we be here again in 2 or 3 months?
Well, and the lack of trust, the lack of certainty is horrendous, isn't it? Yeah. So that previous, when we went into this lockdown, you've literally got one message on Friday, then you wake up Saturday morning and it's like, oh no, everything's changed. And it is exhausting. Every time that happens, the amount of work that your brain has to do, you know, I said when we chatted last time, we like to think of stress is always distress, but it's just work, anything that demands something of your mind. And this season is exhausting because we're having to constantly readjust, reframe, replan. And that's really hard, and it takes an emotional toll on all of us. So if people watching are feeling that sense of just exhaustion, or if you're finding yourself reacting emotionally in ways that feel unusual, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just the nature of this season.
So if many people are feeling different shades of despair, you know, maybe someone's listening think, well, I don't feel despair, but I definitely feel despondent, I feel disappointed, I feel frustrated. Like the opposite of despair for my mind is hope. So what about hope? Like if someone's what you're like, where's the hope? How do I pull myself out of this moment?
Yeah, and here's some good news. So you have a part of your brain that specifically triggers despair, but you have another area of your brain which people call the hope circuit.
Nice.
And the job of that is good, isn't it? Yeah, the job of that bit is to switch off the bit that can trigger despair. So it triggers positive emotions, but it also switches off some of the negative stuff that we experience. And it's really interesting because the balance between those two systems, when you're a kid, the despair one is stronger because you don't have a lot of control over your world. So you don't use a lot of the hope circuit. So hopefully your despair one stays switched off most of the time, but you don't have a lot of control over the two. But as you grow up, particularly in teenage years and adolescence, as you start to understand that you have agency, you can control stuff, you can make decisions. And then hopefully into adult life, as you maintain that sense of control, you can learn to use your hope circuit. And it's really interesting what that means, therefore. You know, there's this verse in the New Testament, both you and I come from a faith perspective here. Some people watching will, some won't, but it's a letter written by a guy called Paul to some of the earliest Christians in Rome. And he says this in the middle of his letter. He says, suffering helps us to endure. And endurance builds character, which gives us a hope that will never disappoint. And what he's saying there, if you look at the original Greek, is when we're forced to endure stuff, to persevere, because frankly, we have no choice. You know, that's the trouble with this season. There is no get out button. We were talking about it yesterday after the call. And it's like, man, I wish we could just take 48 hours off. Do you not think just we could all just cancel, like people saying, let's cancel it over Christmas, just 48 hours. We'll all do stuff that we miss and then we'll come back. If only it was like that. So when we're forced to endure and persevere, yes, if we can harness this hope circuit, we can help ourselves in the moment, but we also build strength and character and maturity and resilience, which we can take into the future. So we can grow our ability to hold tough stuff. We can expand our potential. It can change us. I'm not saying it's character building because apparently that's really annoying. But that is basically what I'm saying. So what's interesting is when we talk to the psychologists, we look at the research, there's some specific things we can do that trigger that hope circuit. So perhaps it's useful for us to talk about them.
Yeah, so just before we dive into that though, because I think there's a fascinating thing about how, you know, like you're saying, how when we're in the struggle, of course it feels horrible, it feels like a nightmare, but actually how we deal with it, and maybe some of the ways that we're about to show us, actually we can come out stronger, we can come out more resilient, we can come out of something that's very tough.
Yeah.
Without, I know that can sound like a cliche, I know that can, you know, but that's got to be part of the hope, isn't it? Like, because
definitely,
if it's just we're going to go into this and it's just going to suck and be awful and stuff, well, there's no hope in that. But actually, if we can reframe this and to be able to say, actually, life really is hard, and this is an exceptionally tough stuff, and it is uncertain and it is painful, but we can find a way through. And as we find that way through, as we look back on it, then we can actually say, yeah, I wish I'd never gone through it, but actually I learned some things. I learned some things about myself. I learned some things about how I do life, and that can build us kind of in an emotional, healthy way.
Yeah, and so often that's the case, isn't it? We look back on the most difficult times and we say they were awful, but they really shaped who we are. We learned stuff through them. And I think what we've got to get away from is that sense of things being really binary. You know, when your brain's under pressure, it starts to shut down your thinking. It's like you go into an emergency mode because you're just exhausted and your brain's just trying to stick to the really essential stuff. And it tries to simplify things and make them very black and white or one thing or another. And what that means is we just think life is either really good or it's a total disaster. Things are either good or they're bad. The reality is most of life is a mix, and this season is really tough. But that doesn't mean you cannot have good things in the midst of difficulty. And I think emotional well-being isn't somehow eradicating all the negative stuff and managing to become superhuman and like annoyingly chirpy positive people. Yeah. And I think some people feel that pressure. They feel that positivity, dealing with this well, managing it psychologically well, is about not letting yourself ever admit that any of it is difficult. Or maybe you do that on your own in the quiet, in the dark at night when nobody else is there, but in front of other people you must keep that, you know, chipper British stiff upper lip, and that's not the case. Actually, it's really important that we have some good, safe, appropriate spaces to say, like, this is really tough, but that will enable us then to get on with it and hold it emotionally really well.
As you know, I recently hit a major birthday. I know I was 50. Those of you watching,
everyone, I'm sure.
Yeah. You're, how could this guy be 50 years old? Thank you for that. So as I've got older, I like to think I'm getting a little bit wiser. And I think one of the things that I've kind of becoming more settled with is learning to live more with contradiction. To be able to actually say, you know what, life really is hard at times. It is painful, it is agonizing, it is tough. And yet at the same time, there are good things that, you know, that there are things that I can be thankful for and that can be grateful for. And you think, how can these things coexist? And that is the mess that we call life. That we live in joy and we live in pain, and things aren't smooth. You know, there's hard stuff and there's good stuff, and it's kind of recognizing both and being real about both. Good friend of mine that you know as well, Paul McGee, brilliant guy. Writing lots of kind of motivational books. He talks about hippo time and how we all need hippo time. There are times that we need to wallow and we need to just be real about how tough things are. We shouldn't avoid that, but actually we don't want to stay there forever. You know, we do want to be.
Yeah, and both are important. You know, when we got the call about the second bout of isolation, you have that moment and it's like, oh, you know, we feel guilty for being upset about it. But actually I was saying, no, actually it's good. Let's do the being upset now, because this sucks. But tomorrow we're going to be positive about it and figure out how we're going to get on with it. But right now is a moment to be like, oh man, this is really hard, you know. And the balance between those is really important. And that's my number one, actually, of the, there's like 3 positive things, or 3 things that we could do that trigger this hope circuit. And number 1, they all start with P, Matt. You're going to be so happy.
I love things begin with
the first one is positive emotions. And it's really interesting because there was so much in that first lockdown about positivity and gratitude, and that stuff's really important. But actually, especially now that we're in just 6, 7, 8 months into it, the most important thing you might need to do now to release your ability to find positive is allowing yourself space to say some of this is hard, because the effort it takes to suppress and hold down the negative emotions is actually significant. And when you're tired, it just adds to how tired you are. And the problem is you cannot selectively switch off just negative emotions. What you end up doing is switching off your whole emotional self. So it works in a short-term crisis where you just have to be head down, get on with it. I'll deal with what I'm feeling later. But in this season, no, those negative emotions, your brains are screaming out because the need to process some of what is going on. What does this mean? What's the impact? How has my life changed? And so many people now are talking about, like, is this life now? And what does that mean? And it's raising these huge questions that, you know, I'm hearing people saying things like, if this is life, then I don't want to, it's not worth living. And you think, gosh, things like that are so huge, so foundational for your mind. You're not going to be able to suppress those things. And if you can, it's going to take a huge amount of pressure. So creating good spaces to express, to process negative, that then release you so that you can then find the positive. Some people are saying to me, I don't find anything fun anymore. I don't laugh anymore. All the joy's gone out of life. And it feels counterproductive. You think, well, the worst thing I could do is focus even more on the crap stuff then. But actually, maybe you need to do that to release your emotional self. And yes, that might mean some tricky stuff. It might mean some tears. It might mean admitting that this sucks, letting yourself just release some of that emotion, some of the stuff that you've held back for 6-7 months now, saying, I miss this person so much. Do you know, I don't think I ever knew that you could actually feel a physical heaviness in your heart until this season. I've heard people talk about it. I've been very lucky. I've not had experiences that have caused that degree, but it's just so achingly awful sometimes, some of the stuff you hear and the stories you share and people's circumstances. We need to really
So we're talking in this first point about positive emotions, but what you're saying is, in order for people to experience and push into positive emotions, we need to be real and handle the negative. But what practically, when you're saying that, to say, like, find ways of expressing them, how we're all different. How can you give us 2 or 3 ideas about how people can express the negative?
It's mostly space.
Okay.
Because that's what your brain needs, space and time, which is great. I mean, they're the 2 things that are most pressed right now. But so I talk about 3 spaces. I think there's space on your own. Mm-hmm. So there's headspace, and people are different. Some people will like different balances of these, but everybody needs some space on their own just to think, what does this mean? And maybe that's just pondering time, prayer time, contemplative time, journaling. Yeah. Listening to podcasts, reading books, whatever it is, but alone time or your time. Then I would say friend and family relationship time, people who know you well enough to be like, mate, I saw how you responded to that. Are you okay? Well, it's interesting. Why do you think that upset you so much? How are you feeling about this? I've done some great walks in the last week or so with some amazing people, and we've had some great conversations around that. How's this going? How's that going? So good relationship time. And the third thing is, some of us sometimes benefit from some therapeutic space.
Right.
Some plan time where there is an expert on the other end of the conversation. Conversations are a bit like playing tennis, and a mate is just like you go and have a knock up. But that can be a bit messy sometimes, and it's just for a laugh, isn't it? Sometimes what we need is someone who's a coach, and they'll hit us the same shot again and again, and they'll see how we're returning it, and they'll shape it, and they'll point out things about, my forehand, or I haven't played tennis for a long time, can you tell? But, and that's what therapeutic space does. And if you've got a challenge, if you've got something particularly difficult, particularly powerful to deal with, like some people have hit like bereavement, really tough stuff, really significant loss, or this has brought to the surface issues with anxiety or depression or other things. And if you're in that space, then a therapeutic sort of space to talk about it can be really useful.
And the interesting thing about that, and we know, a lot with mental health and emotional health, although it's changing, is particularly for many people about seeing a shrink or something. There's a stigma to it, isn't it? People think like, I don't need that. But actually, my own experience, when I went through some tough stuff, in the past, I was so grateful to have 6 sessions with someone who'd never met me and could really help me process the pain of a huge personal struggle, that I went with. And actually, that can be a sign of great strength to admit we don't have all the answers. There are people, thank God, who have been trained to journey with us to reveal this stuff. And so again, I just really want to underline what you've just said, Kate, that having some therapy, having some counseling for some people, could be the best thing that they do. And it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of being brave enough to admit, actually, I need some maybe some professional help with this.
Well, and it goes back to that model, doesn't it? Instead of just thinking, la, 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 I'm not in the ill box, I'm not in the ill box, I'm not, and then crisis, you're like, oh, actually, crap, I am in the ill box. Instead, what if we just thought, actually, this is tough, and I can feel myself being pushed to a place that's tougher, and I'm struggling. And just like with your physical health, you would go and get help with that. You wouldn't wait until, I'll just wait till I have the heart attack, and then I'll deal with it. You go see the doctor as soon as you think, I'm a bit worried about this. And we need to have the same approach with mental health, with emotional health. We can keep ourselves strong. And so much in this season, you know, we hear all these negative stories and it makes it feel like it's inevitable that we're going to struggle really significantly. But actually, I would say so strongly, there's stuff you can implement, there's stuff you can do for you and for your family, for your loved ones, that maybe it can make the difference between you hitting crisis or not. Yeah. And we can support one another in this too. We can get each other through it.
Yeah. And so before you come to your second point, this first one, positive emotions, finding ways of dealing with our negative emotions, and then freeing ourselves up for more positive emotions. Again, can you just give us some practical, how do we move into the positive emotions?
Well, this is the good bit. It's just pursuing fun.
Okay.
But actually,
I love having fun.
Especially as grown-ups, we can be a bit rubbish at that, really. And this season has made it really hard. I mean, we're back in England, we're back on lockdown now, aren't we? Like, so many of the things you do, you sort of sit there and think, right, well, it's the weekend, what shall I do? And it's hard to think of things that are fun, but we need to be creative about it. And we'll talk about connections with people in a minute, but finding ways to do that with other people, to maintain the things that would have made you smile, the things that give you a lighter moment, the things that cause just a chink of light. And our minds are so biased to spot negative that right now we can be totally diverted in doing that and forget to pursue the positive. And it's not like a hedonistic, indulgent thing. We can feel guilty for doing that, especially those of us who've got loads of responsibilities. There's an ancient Hebrew verse in the Old Testament of the Bible that says that joy is our strength, and it literally, the word used means it's our fortress, it's our place of protection, it's something you retreat to when times are tough or in a battle or in a storm. And I love that reminder that, like, the habits, the things you do that are fun, your hobbies, your joy-giving moments, they get you through. Yeah. And in a moment when the rest of life has become really rubbish, sometimes those things become like oases, stepping stones through that perfect storm of awfulness. And we've got to be really creative and intentional about how we do them.
So we want to encourage folks tonight, find what are your life-giving hobbies, activities, things that just do you good, that you just enjoy, that they bring some joy, and to push into those positive emotions. Thanks, Kate. What's the second P?
So the second one, which hopefully is very linked to positive stuff and fun, is people. And it is connection with people. And it's another really basic need that we have as humans, that we are designed to do life in community and connection with people. And that has been so pressured in this time. And again, it's not an indulgent, it is an absolute need. If we look at one of the things that triggers that hope circuit that helps us keep going in difficult times, our connections, our relationships, the people who we care for, but also the people who care for us, that stuff is absolutely vital. And of course, we've got to, again, be creative and find better ways of doing this. And, you know, it's something I've really thought about this time, because looking back and reflecting on the first lockdown, isn't it depressing that we have to call it lockdown 1 now? It's like, we just thought there was anything
2.0.
Anyway, lockdown 1, my reflections looking back on that was just realizing I don't think I did the people thing that well. I'm a massive introvert, so I don't like what feels to me like superficial conversation. I like to see people face to face, to do the really good chats and really get together and catch up, and I hated it. So in the first lockdown, I just withdrew. I don't really need people. I'm an introvert. I could just go in my own head and it's all fine. In this one, I'm being much more deliberate. I'm even doing flipping Zoom. I mean, check me out. I mean, not for work. We're all on Zoom all the time for that, but for friendship Zoom, phone calls. And we've got to think of how we're going to do this. And I talk about 3 things: who, how, and when. And this is advice I'm giving myself. So who, the temptation when it's difficult is we retreat down to like 1, maybe 2 core relationships. If we're lucky. And please don't feel insulted if I didn't speak to you through the whole of lockdown. That does not mean that I don't count you as one of my 1 or 2 core relationships.
Yeah, I'm not sure how often you call me now. I'm feeling a little bit
Only when I had to, frankly. Anyway, so we've all gone down just to those one or two, but most of our relationship color comes from incidental overlap with people. It's the little bantery moments. It's the people who you probably wouldn't put at the top of your friendship list, but actually really bring something to your life. You know, those people you see at the bus stop every day, or your mates at work who maybe wouldn't be your best friends, but actually you have a lot of laughs together. Or, you know, that the club or the football that you used to do, but you haven't been able to do now. People at church you've not seen. Some of those will be your best mates, but a lot of them are just people who are in your life. So think about who, and do you need to broaden that? And how can you broaden it? Are there some connections you need to remake, some spaces you need to create? And then how is obviously thinking about how you do that. And there's a lot of this sort of thing online, Zoom.
And you can't go for a walk with someone at the moment. I believe that's in the lockdown.
If you're not isolating, I should say.
Not if you're isolating, no.
I'm not personally isolating, but I know that some people are. So yeah, if you can do one-to-one walks, which is amazing. Such a difference, especially for the introverts amongst us. I like that. But there, you can still do phone calls, letters, texting. There's so many different ways that you can make connection with people. So let's not narrow it. Let's not just opt out. Just because the idea of doing some kind of Zoom pub quiz is your idea of absolute hell on earth doesn't mean that you just can't connect with people until COVID is over. You could do that if it was just 2 to 3 months of a weird moment, but this is much longer. We need to figure out how we can do it. And then my top tip here, especially if like me you're not very good at this, is schedule it. You know, when you see someone and you do that whole thing of like, oh, it's so nice to see you, oh, we must catch up sometime, yes, and you go off and you think, yeah, I'm not going to see you for another 2 years now. If you don't make a date, if you don't make a plan, you won't do it. So if it matters, and if you know for your mental health and well-being this matters, but also for other people, because there are people out there who need you, who need you, and they need me, and they need the people who are watching, because they've become isolated and they're struggling. So schedule it, and if possible, make it regular, make it part of a routine. So you could have like a weekly call or a weekly drop in with some mates, or, you know, a daily touch base with someone, a daily text at the same time, or maybe you just have a thing where every day at 6 o'clock you send a quick WhatsApp and you both say a prayer for each other. You don't have to do anything massive. That's you know, sometimes we're so all or nothing. We think, frankly, if I can't have someone around to dinner and spend 6 hours putting the world to rights, then I'm not doing anything. In this season, we've got to be much more creative, much more flexible about how we do it.
And can I, before we move on to the last point, and we're aiming to wrap about 10 past, 8 people. I know we've got Alex and Gary hosting online, and we may have time for 1 or 2 questions. And so if you've got a question, put it in the comments, and Alex and Gary will WhatsApp us, and we'll try and draw it in at the end if there's time. But just before we dive onto the last P, you mentioned earlier that you and I are people of faith, and one of the kind of wise sayings of Jesus that I just wondered is related to this point that you've just made about people, was that actually when we give, when we are kind and other-centered, when we look out for other people, actually that does us good. And so, you know, sometimes, of course, like, you know, when we're feeling really, really low, it's hard to reach out to others. But as a strategy to build up our own sense of emotional well-being, Jesus seemed to suggest that a really catalytic thing can be when we are kind and other-centered. Like, is there anything to back that up?
Yeah, definitely. There's actually loads of really interesting psychological research that would show that, and some of it is in triggering this hope circuit, but also if you reach out and do something kind for someone else, it's one of the most powerful things you can do to lift your mood. In fact, there's even studies that show that doing things like random acts of kindness or things that reach out to other people are as powerful in lifting your mood as some of our antidepressant medication.
Wow.
I'm not saying like stop taking your meds and just like send people texts, but maybe that's what I'm saying. Some of these things that we can do habitually and behaviorally actually are really powerful. So something like just the things that we would never have thought about before we hit this season, but that did maintain our well-being. If we now we have to be more deliberate, more intentional. But if we can build those things back in, we can keep ourselves going with them, whether that's going out for our daily walk or keeping in touch with people, whatever it is.
So if we were, off the back of this thinking, wow, is there one person as part of your shed anything every day I want to just send a text or message someone, just say, I'm thinking of you, and or whatever, that's going to do that person good. Like we all love receiving those kind of messages, but it's going to do us good as well. Thank you for that. Last P.
The last P is productivity.
Okay.
And this basically comes down again to our human need. It's where we started, that we do need to feel like we're in control. We need to feel like we're getting somewhere, we're achieving something. One of the hardest things about this season is just how difficult it is for us as human beings to feel like we're just killing time, because we feel like we need to be moving somewhere. And actually, one of the challenges of this season is there will be moments, like if you're on isolation for a couple of weeks, where actually killing time, filling 14 days or whatever it is actually a really good thing to do. And that is enough of an achievement for you. And you kind of need to do the mental work of thinking, this is an unusual space. And for me, if I can think of some stuff to fill 10 to 14 days, that's an achievement in itself. But wider than that, again, thinking about what can we do to overcome the natural sort of struggle that we've got with a bit of despair, demoralization, just feeling down, the more we can feel like we're getting somewhere, we're achieving something, the more that will help to redress that balance. And I guess we've got to do it, though, in the right way, because our culture is so achievement based, so striving, that what we can end up feeling is that if we're not absolutely nailing something awesome, remember that binary thing when your brain feels under pressure, you're either brilliant or you're a total failure. You're either good or you're bad. What we end up feeling is we're not the person who went viral or who started an entire new charity or wrote a sonnet or I don't know, whatever people did that was amazing. And I'm not dissing people's achievements in lockdown one. That those things are all amazing, but most of us, I didn't achieve any of those things. I was lucky some days if I got through it without yelling too much, or if I managed to get out of my pajamas, so some of us, we need to just bring our expectations down and accept what achievement is going to look like in this season. And that doesn't mean you're a failure. It's just about being human. So where we can put things into place that play with this need to achieve, that will help us loads. Let me give you an example. So my son, many of you will know I have an 8-year-old son who has just come out of 14 days of isolation. So when it started, I sat down with him and I talked to him. I was like, mate, what should we do in this season that helps you feel like you've achieved something? And I was like, maybe we could start a project, or you could read a book, or
a Lego model, maybe.
Do you know, I love Lego. I'm totally with you on Lego. Yeah.
Anyway, anyone watching this love Lego? Put it in the comments.
Absolutely. But so he goes off, he thinks, but he comes back and he's like, Mum, I've got it. I've decided what I'm going to do. So I'm like, great. What is it? He's like, I'm going to have 14 consecutive pajama days.
Wow.
And I'm like, that's not really what I was thinking about. But then and my instinctive parental reaction was like, no, I was thinking a project or write something, or maybe just learn to spell. Anyway, minor things, maybe some times tables. But then I thought about it. I thought, actually, it's brilliant. What he's done is psychologically brilliant, because he's taken something that could feel like a real failure. I didn't get dressed, or I'm actually struggling a bit with that. And he's thought, you know what? I'm going to make that an achievement. I'm going to make it measurable. I'm going to make it fun. Remember the positive emotion thing. So we did it. I didn't, but he did his 14 consecutive pajama days, and we celebrated it. And you can play things with yourself, like make it measurable, put a chart on the wall, tick things off, flipping it, give yourself stickers if it helps, anything that helps you feel like I'm getting somewhere. Every time you get out of bed, you take a shower, you get dressed, if you're finding things really, really tough, those things are achievements, tick them off. Maybe it's about, so you want to tidy something or sort something out. Again, think about how can you achieve it? Take before and after photos, stick them on your Instagram, whatever works for you. But let's think about how can we feel like we're getting somewhere. Maybe it's a time to, like you say, take up a new hobby, dig out a Lego box you've got somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. My next door neighbor, Stu, he has been observing me over many months repairing and sanding and undercoating the windowsills in my house. It's taken me a very, very long time, mainly because I just get bored after about half an hour, but little and often. But I'm nearly there. It's literally taken me about 4 months. But every time I do a bit, I just feel like, okay, no, that looks a little bit better now. I mean, if you are a DIY whiz, do not look at my windowsills. Please don't do that. But it has felt a sense of satisfaction. And actually, even in the last 3 or 4 weeks, a friend of me had recommended this app, Duolingo. I'm not on a commission or anything. And like 10 minutes a day, I'm slowly learning Spanish. And again, it's just a little thing that occupies my mind and drives my wife crazy because sometimes I'm speaking Spanish to it. But
those little things help, don't they? One of my lowest days in the first lockdown, when I did just have one of those days you just think I just want to lie on the floor and not move for quite a long time, I tidied my spice drawer, and actually my oldest spice was like 2002. It was quite impressive, but I sorted through it, got it all in order, and it killed some time. It got me out of a slump, but also I really did feel a lot better actually from doing that. And on Saturday, when they announced the lockdown 2, my daughter came down, she's like, Mum, have you tidied your spice drawer yet? And I'm like, no, but I'm on the verge. Because it helps us, it gets us through. And I think playing with some of these things and recognizing that is a success. People come to me at the moment and I think what they want is for me to tell them how to make this not awful. And I can't do that. I'm really sorry. This is probably one of the most challenging things that we've ever experienced as human beings, and universally across cultures, nations, backgrounds. It's really hard. So I can't change the fact that it's hard, but I can give you some tricks, some tips, some tools that will help you get through it and help you get your loved ones through it. And help you to hold what is, it's a bit like treading water in a difficult season until at some point things will turn, that there are better things ahead. And we've talked about hope, but there is that verse that I talked about in the Bible. Paul is ultimately talking about an even bigger hope, which is about what stories are being told over us as people. And right now, so many of the stories that we hear on the news, on the media, in the arguments people are having on social media, they're so depressing, so hopeless. Yeah. And actually, like you and I would both believe that there is a bigger story, there's a better story that's being told. That this is not the end of our story as people. This is not where the story ends with COVID and then it just got really crap and it stayed terrible. Like there are better days ahead. Yeah. There are brighter days ahead. So sustaining ourselves well is a really good thing to do, because we will see something better out of this.
Brilliant. Kate, we're going to finish in a minute, but I do want to just pick up on that, because understandably, you and I both know, we hear it a lot and we understand it, that there may be people watching here and hopefully they've found this really helpful and inspiring and practical. But here we are, people of faith who do believe in a bigger story about a God who loves us. And one of the biggest questions that people have in times like this is, look, we're all suffering, we're all struggling, and you say that God loves and cares about us. How can that possibly be so, that God loves us and cares for us when we're in so much suffering? Can you give us a thought on that?
What, in 3 minutes? Yeah.
just 2.5, actually.
I actually think this season is really interesting in our understanding of some of the bigger story arcs, and ultimately, if you go back to the sort of creation story, that you may believe is literal, you may believe it's like a fable that describes how the world and people came about, whatever you believe, the story is one of the balance and the battle between chaos and order. And before God steps in and starts creation, there is chaos, there is just a big swirl that amounts to nothing. And what God does is he takes that and brings order, and things like day and night, light and dark. He separates the land and the sea and stuff like that. And then he puts humans in charge, and he basically says to human beings, like the Bible says, subdue the earth, take control, hold this balance between chaos and order. And that is the sort of foundational perspective that we have, that God put us in charge here. And I think there are decisions that we've made as human beings that when we skew away from God's dream for how this was supposed to work, that chaos bubbles back up in creation. And so in the midst of all of that, is God absent? No. Like the story of God, the very first time that happens in the creation story, when Eve eats the fruit off the tree, when God has said don't, the very first thing that happened is God is looking for her. He's desperately calling, like, where are you? He's seeking us. He wants to help. And God has a dream for us that ultimately one day he will reinstate. The Bible talks about this moment when everything will be brought back to the way that God dreamed for it to be for us as human beings. But in the meantime, he brings us the good things. We can get a taste, like a flicker of what that stuff is on this earth, in the good moments that we do see. You know, in the midst of challenge, in the midst of darkness, we still see amazing things which come from God, the goodness of people, the hope that people can bring, the joy that we can have in simple moments. All of those things, I believe, are good stuff that one day will come back to dominating.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. I don't know if you've noticed, my social media feed is starting to fill up with people who've already put their Christmas trees up. And I know usually we're like shock horror, like, you know, it's way too early, but I think there is something now where just like Christmas is a sign of hope, this season, a sign of joy. And it's like people want to bring it forward into their present. They want to bring it forward now. And I definitely get that. And I think, you know, obviously for us, like one of the great backgrounds of Christmas is God with us, that God has come to be with us. And what, you know, one of my favorite little verses in the Bible, you know, speaks about the God who catches our tears. And the God who doesn't promise that, as you say, in the chaos of our world, that we won't go through times of suffering, but promises to be with us and to help us come through to a better day. And I guess as we start to close, we hope all the things we've talked about have been really helpful to you. But as we close, we just invite you to be open to the possibility, not just that there is a God there, out there somewhere, distant and disconnected, but there's a God who's up close and personal, who is with us in our suffering and struggle, who dries our tears, captures and dries our tears, and invites us to reach out to him for his help. You know, we do these practical things ourselves and we reach out to something beyond ourselves, like literally, God help us, God help us. And maybe you will, maybe you will. But Kate, it's been so great to have this time with you. I think we're back together in a couple of weeks where we're going to look a little bit about connectedness and isolation. Can you just give us a little taste of
Yeah, well, we will chat a bit more about friendship. It is such an interesting topic, particularly even before COVID. A lot of people actually struggle with friendship. Like, how do you do that? How do you make friends? What do you do if you don't feel like you have the depth of friendship you want? So we will talk about some really practical things about how we can do that, and particularly in this time, how can we form, develop and maintain friendships? What do you do if there's friendships that have come under pressure, that have been questioned? Maybe you've had fallings out and rows, because there's been a bit of that in this season. We're going to look at that whole area.
That's brilliant. Well, we're looking forward to that. You've been amazing. Thank you so much, Kate. Next Sunday, same time, 7:30, live on YouTube, I'll be introducing and interviewing Juliet and Keith Johnson, who for years have been involved in marriage coaching, not counseling, but coaching, helping married couples and relationships thrive. And we know, like, again, this time of lockdown has put relationships and marriages under huge pressure. So we're looking forward to hearing from Juliet and Keith next week to, again, help us understand what's going on, help us understand how we do our relationships better. So do join us for that next week. If you'd love to keep in touch with us at Zeo Church, get our emails and texts, then if you go to zeochurch.com/connect, that's zeochurch.com/connect. You can leave a mobile and or an email, subscribe, check out some of the stuff that we send. We hope it'll encourage you and give you a view of what's coming up. But for now, thanks very much. Thanks again, Kate. And
thanks, Matt.